longing for change, and could you explain what you mean by that, or give us some explanation of that?
Well, I think the idea that science fiction or fantasy writers have a longing for change comes up out of context. I see the question as one that has more to do with our literature and society as a whole. And in order to understand the question, I think we need to understand that we have been in a time where, say, a fear of change has been manifest in a lot of different areas. It's been very obvious in our literature. Mainstream literature since, say, the Second World War has been almost universally nihilistic. It's been a black comedy. It's been a preaching of the kind of end of not human life, but of human dignity as we know it. Probably the best single summation of mainstream literature over the past 30 years has been Jean-Paul Sartre's definition of what it means to be human. Man is a futile passion. And it's reached the point in literature where, in order to be respected, you have to take that attitude. If you come to your view of humanity with anything other than an assumption of futility, you're not taken seriously. Now, science fiction and fantasy literature, although they're very different from each other, both operate from certain kinds of assumptions which tend to contradict that. If you're going to write science fiction, you're going to write about the future. Now you're going to assume that there is a future. You're going to assume that human beings do continue, regardless of some presumably intelligent awareness of how huge the problems we face are. We're still going to be here. There's a core assumption of continuance that is essential to science fiction. Fantasy is a different question. It involves assumptions of internal integrity, so we should probably not get distracted by that. But this assumption of a future is, for some writers, an enabling device which allows them to tackle the questions of human effectiveness, or to tackle the problems of nihilism, and come up with different answers than they are allowed to come up with in mainstream literature. The assumption is so implicit and so enabling that it attracts writers who want to be able to say something else about what it means to be human. I should probably back up for a second and just say that, in my view, the purpose of all literature is to try to answer the question, what it means to be human. And you can rephrase that, any way you want. Who are we and why are we here? Who is God and what does she think she's doing? There's a whole range of different ways that you can articulate the question. It's all basically the same question. For me, the most convenient way to talk about it is, what does it mean to be human? And because of its implicit assumption, science fiction attracts writers who want to find some believable way to say that man is an effective passion, that it is possible to confront the issues that the future presents, that change presents, that global stress presents, that psychological stress and despair present, that it's possible to tackle those issues and come up with something else besides we're doomed. There's no point in getting out of bed in the morning. Read enough John Barth novels and you'll stop getting out of bed in the morning yourself. So it's in the nature of the material that certain types of writers come to it, because it enables them to say what they want to say. A longing for change, no. A longing for some sort of concept of who we are that transcends futility, yes. And in order to tackle those kinds of questions, you, of course, have to tackle the questions of change. And, in all its guises.
Great. In the case of science fiction, how does art mirror life?
Well, the question of how science fiction mirrors life has to do, I think, with the fundamental nature of what science fiction is. remember, literature is trying to answer the question of what it means to be human. The specific techniques that science fiction uses to answer this question involve radical changes in the environment, either the social environment, the physical environment, the cultural environment, which involves the idea of contact with other life forms, the spatial environment having to do with whether we're restricted to this particular time and space. It involves making radical changes in those kinds of areas and testing definitions or possibilities of humanity against those changes to try to find out where we leave off and where otherness or alienness or breakdown or death come in. Ultimately, the thrust, it seems to me, has to do with trying to refine or purify a definition of what makes us who we are, and so that we can then say, in some sense, this is human, this is not, this is alien. It is believable that human beings will function or flourish in this kind of environment. It is not believable that in this alternative social context that one could retain one's humanity. If future Y is hypothesized, we would have to exist as we recognize ourselves. If future X is hypothesized, we would lose this and this about ourselves, but we would still be something that we can see as being human. From that point of view, as in any literature, science fiction is trying to reflect directly a real sense of who we are as human beings. Ultimately, the test is in the reader. If the reader understands intuitively or empathetically or can see themselves in what it is the writer is talking about, then we have touched something that is fundamental to the fundamentally human, fundamental to the connection between the writer and the reader. And so, no matter how wild the circumstances may become, the focus is on trying to understand human beings. Now, this operates on, on any level that any level that you happen to be interested in it, or the writer happens to be interested in. It can be a psychological test for individuals. It can be a social test for large groups, a definition of cultures, a definition of how large or small groups of people solve problems. One can tackle the question of what it means to be human on any one of these fronts, and individual writers tackle it differently based on their own interests and presuppositions. I myself am inclined to tackle it on the questions that have to do with the relationships between human beings and machines. I'm writing a story now in which a character has been involuntarily merged with a computer so that the computer controls his volition. And he, in theory, can no longer make choices. Well, is he still a human being? If he's still a human being, where does his humanity reside? How does it express itself? What's left to him if the technology has become so great that the only purpose of organic tissue is as a host? Now, that's my personal bent, because I'm focus on individual psychology more than broader sociological issues. But other writers can and do very fruitfully tackle these questions on a broader canvas. There's a science fiction writer named C.J. Cherryh who postulates entire alien societies and brings them into conflict with human politics. She has posited a world in which humanity is at war with itself on 2 or 3 different fronts, all having to do with technological developments. There are the people who live on the space stations and why their community of interests is different than the people who actually fly the spaceships, which is different than the community of interests who people are back on Earth. And so they have a believable psychological and social political struggle going on, and now they encounter methane breathers who speak in psychological matrices instead of linear language. And the effort to try to understand, to try to define yourself, and to make something happen in a context like this is powerfully presented in a writer like that. Now there one would see sociological and cultural issues center stage in the study of what it means to be who we are. On every level, though, as I said from the beginning, we're ultimately involving a direct reflection, not of the reality of our physical world, but the psychological and social and cultural reality of what it means to be a human being. And it's very much true in the present. It has to work in the present, or else nobody's going to read it, because it won't be sympathetic.
In science fiction, I'm going to read this whole crazy sentence. Characters are often forced to make radical choices in regard to changes in the environment. You touched on this already, but in regard to invasion or cultural contact, or population shifts, or cultural diffusion, or ideas from one world or another, how similar are these themes to social change in the real world?
Well, I think the kinds of changes and themes that are dealt with in science fiction are literally and directly relevant to the changes and themes we're dealing with in our world. I mean, ultimately, I would say they are the same. Despite the alien and almost extravagant difference sometimes in the literal landscape that is being presented in a science fiction novel, the issues are probably exactly the issues that all of us are facing in our present lives, and there are a couple of reasons for that. One is, of course, the science fiction writer wants the future that he or she is presenting to be believable. It has to be extrapolated in some way from the known, from known problems, from known stresses, from known changes. And the most common, most simple, most normal technique for doing that is to simply to focus on an issue and distill it or exaggerate it. Exaggeration is one of the classic tools of literature from time immemorial, and science fiction is only one more example of that. You take something which is recognizably believable as an issue which will affect our future as it affects our present, and push it a little further. Exaggerate it, distill it, so that it then becomes, on the one hand, it becomes a little simpler, perhaps. On the other hand, it becomes a little clearer. There's a wonderful novel named Hardwired by a writer named Walter John Williams, which focuses on medical change. It is not hard to get to the type of world that he presents, in which, for instance, advanced knowledge of body chemistry has introduced a whole new range of recreational drugs, as people now have the opportunity to mainline endorphins instead of having to snort cocaine or something like that. Furthermore, the medical research has enabled all kinds of really effective plastic surgery so that people can totally change their appearance depending upon the job or the circumstances or what's required. You know, when you go in to apply for a job, it doesn't matter what you look like now, because you will be remade to look like what they want for the job that you have to do. In addition, people have prosthetic resources installed in their bodies, sometimes weapons, sometimes computer chips with databases, sometimes reflexes, sometimes communication equipment, so that individuals are technologically enhanced in a variety of ways. And then it goes further into like the operation of jets, cars, equipment. There's a pure mental interface between the mind and the machine. The driver doesn't turn the steering wheel. He takes a jack that plugs the car's computer into a computer chip that's in the side of his head, and then he runs the car directly from his brain to the car without needing to make the mistakes that his hands might make. Well, this sounds pretty wild on one level, and yet it's really not very far removed from the kinds of things that we are already having to deal with in the world of medicine and medical change. It's not, we have plastic surgery already. It's not far from hip replacement to hip replacements where there's a little motor in the hip that helps you turn your new artificial hip. It's not far from L-tryptophan, which some of us used to get a little more sleep, to catecholamine inhibitors, which reduce certain types of neural activity in the brain. here is an extremely vivid world that Walter John Williams has presented. It's vivid, it's convincing, and all it involves is a distillation or a concentration or an exaggeration of stuff that we already have to live with. So from that point of view, any issue is, if the book is plausible and strong, if the science fiction is strong, then it is, of course, talking about themes, changes, problems that we have to face right now. I mean, we already have movies that deal with the subject that I mentioned earlier of human beings being blended with machines. It's easy to imagine that computers are not far away from self-programming, and when they start self-programming, it will be very difficult to tell the difference between a computer and an intelligence. And it's easy to imagine a relationship, human beings having to struggle for a relationship with this type of development. It's a theme which is already present in our world. It's just been exaggerated. It's been pushed a little further into the future. Now, the other reason these ideas are essentially the same is because of something that I believe is fundamentally true about change itself. I think that no matter what happens to us, it is going to be different than we expected. We all like to guess, we like to forecast, we like to have a crystal ball, and it never turns out that way. It's very easy to predict a nuclear holocaust. It's very easy to predict that the greenhouse effect is essentially going to microwave us all at a certain point. It's easy to predict that acid rain is going to melt the flesh from our bones. But there is something about not just the nature of humanity, but the nature of change that makes it so that these things never turn out the way we expected. Part of that is simply because becoming aware of the problem, we change the dynamics of the problem. We change our relationship to the problem. We, as human beings, have a history of devising partial, ambiguous, and dissatisfying solutions to these problems, which do in fact prevent the problems from being catastrophic, and give rise to a whole host of new problems which we had would never guessed would be true. This is the essence of science fiction. One of the things that happens in any good, strong science fiction novel is that the future that's presented is both believable and unexpected. The writer is seeing possibilities for the future that become convincing as soon as he says it, but that we never thought of for ourselves. Well, that is the nature of change itself. If it weren't unexpected, if it weren't unpredictable, if its implications and valences did not exert stresses that we were not aware of, we wouldn't call it change. We'd call it something else because it would be familiar. As long as it's contained within the dynamics of the known, it's not change. Precisely the reason that stress is hard on us is because it always involves thrusting us into circumstances that we could not predict, that we are not prepared for, and that we have to scramble to try to survive. Well, from that point of view, science fiction is talking exactly about the same things that we're all living, the implications of future shock in all its guises for us and our society, the implications of population expansion and the related medical stuff, which makes it so that we're all living longer, so that we not only have to put up with more crowding than we used to, but we have to put up with it longer than we used to, which in turn enhances the crowding. All this stuff, we're bombarded with this kind of thing all the time. It's exactly what science fiction and fantasy writers are talking about directly. So I would argue that there's a one-to-one correlation between the themes and decisions and changes that are postulated in science fiction and the actual stuff that we are dealing with right here today.
It occurs to me that at least some science fiction writers have a social conscience, from what you just said. Do you agree with that?
Well, some human beings have a social conscience. The truth is that writers, artists of any kind, come in every flavor in the same way that other human beings come in every flavor. We have certainly science fiction writers who are not just deeply concerned about, say, ecological issues as fictional devices, but are concerned about them as conscience issues. Certainly, that would be true in the same complex way that it's true of any group of human beings. My own work, I am often considered a moralist in my own writing, not because I preach, but because I care about ethical questions, and my characters raise ethical questions and struggle with ethical questions. That's me. There are plenty of other writers for whom those issues don't come up, but entirely different issues do come up. The books that I am best known for, the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, are often viewed as passionate pleas for the protection of the environment. Well, it happens that I, as a person, respond to environmental issues. If I wanted to define evil in the modern world, I might very well call it toxic dumping. Well, that's me. It's part of what makes me a distinctive individual as a writer, and it makes my books worth reading, because they are not the same as somebody else's. But it's also true of the other side. Other people are concerned or interested or excited on entirely different ways. And some of us have very strange consciences. Some of us preach, some of us don't. Some of us are believers of one kind or another. Some of us are theorists of one kind or another. And you couldn't generalize on that point. Except to the extent that I made the point in the beginning that science fiction itself attracts people who are drawn to the idea that man is an affective passion. Now that lies at the core, whether the writers are conscious of it or not. That lies at the core of this type of field. And on that level, all of us who write this stuff do have something profound in common.
It occurs to me that there is also this strain of thought in sociology, that human beings do have the ability to change their world, and that social science, that one of the purposes of social science is to provide people with that, what I would call that kind of aha experience, of social life that I heard you talking about with regard to literature. Do you have any comments on that, or I don't know if you know very much about social science or the social sciences. Do you see any parallels at all between what the social science is trying to do and literature?
Well, in one sense, it seems to me that they're directly parallel. Obviously, the whole point of psychology, sociology, I would argue it even for economics, physics, biology, as well as literature, is to understand what it means to be human. You confront the question using different tools, and in a manner of speaking, in a different arena. But the impulse is the same. Now, sociologists, I would hypothesize, deal with human beings in aggregate, whereas the essence of fiction is its particularity. It deals with individuals. And, we all know from our own experience that our behavior as individuals is different than our behavior as groups of individuals. We even have different emotions when we're in groups than we do when we're functioning individually. That is not irrelevant to literature, but analyzing that process and working with it is of a different kind and might very well involve a different set of tools or a different set of assumptions. Being the kind of person that I am, the fact is I'm a fiction writer, and I'm a fiction writer because I believe in fiction writing. I believe in storytelling. And I think that story is the most profound tool for trying to understand who we are. Well, that's me, I believe that, and so I write stories. I don't expect other people to believe it. I hope to persuade them that the stories that I write are worth reading, and that reading them will enhance their lives and their understanding not only of themselves but of their context. Other tools are obviously valid, and clearly sociologists and psychologists and physicists and economists are all using different tools, ultimately with the same end in view.